This episode, and indeed the next one, does not have a happy ending. So before we get into all of that, I just want to present you with a little sideshow. 1989, third term. The Fitzroy reserves find themselves 39 points down in the grand final. Playing that day were some names that you know and some names that you will know. Regular viewers may remember Mick Conlon playing his final game today. Leon Harris was there too. Mark Scott also played, the last Saint to play a full season and lead the goal kicking before Lockett walked into the building, really going out on a high note. Ken Hinkley also featured, having left the city of Melbourne and therefore Fitzroy at the end of 1988. But also playing were some bright young stars. The Roy's defence was shored down by Stephen Paxman and Peter Caven, both future premiership winners, albeit not at Fitzroy. Doc Wilden kicked 4 and kick-started his journey to becoming a bizarre cult hero, while David Strooper and Jason Baldwin were handy talents. And it's not like they were playing a bunch of tomato cans. The Cats featured a young Robert Scott and Adrian Fletcher, established talent in Damien Drum and Mark Yates, and even a pre-successful Michael Mansfield, Sean Denham, Andrew Wills, and future Supercars title winner Matthew the Pain Dog Payne. No, sorry, wrong guy. Got a bit overexcited. Big ups to Cujo, by the way, and yes, I am determined to strong-arm my dumbass nickname for him into regular use. So yeah, 39 points down in the grand final, pretty late on. But it was the most decorated player of the bunch who turned the tide. John Ironmonger, the 1983 Sandover medalist, must have been wondering what went wrong in life. He'd been lured to a Sydney side flushed with cash and in his first VFL season fell 2 votes short of a Brownlow medal top 10. Despite that, he found himself shuffled out the next year by ex-Fitzroy man Glenn Coleman. In a dose of irony, he revived his career by moving to Fitzroy, coming second for hitouts in 1988, not for Fitzroy, but for the league. It was, again, a false dawn. He'd taken huge ruck minutes as Matt Rendell missed the whole year with injury. With the big man back, Ironmonger didn't play a minute of senior football in 1989. Forced to play well below his level, he simply took the fucker over with his work rate. Fitzroy got on top in the ruck battle and superior clearance work got the Roys back in it. They pegged their way back as they've done so many times before. With some 7 minutes left, Conlon links with Ironmonger. He's exhausted from his Herculean efforts, but still piles a long bomb to Harris, the stars all getting involved. He taps it down to Andrew Marcoux. Don't get him confused with big brother Alex. Andrew never played senior footy. This match, with 3 goals, was his finest hour, with this dodge of a sample best and fairest in Darren Troy, and a crisp hand pass, his finest seconds. The hand pass finds a weird player. Much as this match was Mickey Conlon's farewell, so too was it Ross Thornton's swan song. An ever-present part of the Roy's backline throughout the 1980s, the 1984 Best and Fairest winner was a total stranger to this half of the ground. In 146 senior matches, he'd managed only 26 goals and only a single behind over the last 2 years. Today, though, the oldest man on the ground swoops up the field and takes his chance. 2 minutes later, Thornton lays 2 desperate tackles to stall Geelong's attack. Not content with that, he intercepts their next counter and then turns provider with a lace-out hand pass. Tony Woods, in the start of a very handy 173-game 3-club career, sends a low drive home for 6. Fitzroy lead by 2, their biggest lead since Geelong's first score of the day. The side that finished 5th in the regular season is in the box seat to win it all. But, as is always the case with the Roys, nothing worth having ever comes easy. Doc Wilden sends the potential sealer out on the full. Ironmonger dominates the ruck so hard he earns a decapitation, leading to another Wilden chance and another out on the full. But Still, we're in a good place. 1 minute 11 seconds. That's all this lead has to last for to give Fitzroy a trophy. But we've seen this movie before, haven't we? Fitzroy put on a gallant effort, but in the end, you either do or you die. Fitzroy always die. They have in the distant past. They died for fun in the 80s, they'll die for real a few years down the line, and they will die once again in the present, as the Cats sweep the ball up in a manner 90s Cats fans would lap up, even using some of the same names: Rogers, Malachellis, Mansfield. An unfamiliar name in Gribble marks and puts one up there. Andrew Brockhurst does really well against two. The ball comes down, Malachellis teleports from all the damn way back here to pounce, but misses. Fitzroy is safe. Except they're not. The ump has called the mark to Paul Brown, future two-time AFL Grand Finalist. He is 10 metres out. Brockhurst is heartbroken. For Fitzroy, this would be the last roll of the dice. The reserves and under-19s leagues were on their way out, and a club like the 1990s Royals was never going to attract the calibre of recruit needed to win them anyway. It may have been the Magoos, but the club needed this. There was a lot on Brown's shoulders, though. Geelong may have done a Resi's three-peat at the start of the decade, but only one other cup had come through the door since the seniors last saluted in 1963. Their under-19s had just gone down by a point in the prelim replay that morning, and their seniors would lose by a kick that afternoon. Brown himself would lose his two senior grand finals, and the club would lose the one he missed in 1992. They needed something to come out of all of this. He runs in. Brockhurst dances on the mark, does all he can to put Brown off, but it's a fool's errand. Brown completes the motions, a dotting of the I on the easiest goal he will ever kick in his life. Brockhurst turns around in utter despair to watch the ball on its inevitable flight between the two big sticks.
Oh, he's missed and hit the post, I think. It's a behind. Oh dear.
Brockhurst kicks in for Fitzroy. Close to the boundary line, Thornton takes the mark. 10 seconds left in the grand final. Out goes Ironmonger, but no whistle for that. And it's a Geelong mark, but the time is out. Geelong too far out to score. Burke's kick, and the Lions have got up to win it by 2 points.
From fifth.
And Michael Conlon is rather happy.
Well done, Nick.
Look, let's just sit back and enjoy this footage for a bit. Nothing wrong with taking our time. The rest of history's been waiting for years. It can wait a little bit longer. This is, surprisingly, not the only colour footage of a Fitzroy title win. The under-19s won in 1982, but it is the last title win. This is the last time that we will see this club, in the state that it exists in now, succeed. Drink it in, because moments like this are fleeting. Time passes by so quick, and if we don't stop to remember this, it'll just slip away. Oh. The protagonist of Eric Bogle's opus and the band played Waltzing Matilda begins as a rambler, wandering the country to no end in particular, and so too were Fitzroy as the 1990s began. They'd boarded a lifeboat to escape their sinking ship, only for it to be torpedoed by a different sinking ship. They'd had to scuttle back aboard the SS Fitzroy and simply wait for it to disappear beneath the waters as the band played La Marseillaise in the background. What kind of helmsman does a sinking ship need? Would you rather someone who readies the lifeboats and guides everybody to one, or someone who tries to fix the dang boat while it's going down, water be damned? Well, Dyson Hall-Lacey was both. A fiery QC known for his outbursts of passion and for never giving up even the most dire of causes, he'd made his bread working for Indigenous people's causes and soon became known as a champion of the underdogs and a fiercely determined fighter. A perfect fit for the Lions, then. He was actually a Melbourne fan, enamoured with the fellow Tasmanians they recruited, and even got to chinwag with Norm and Ron when the D's sought his own signature. He signed for Richmond though, mainly because Jack Dyer invaded his school, but only lasted a short while. He kept following footy and, over time, slowly shifted in the Fitzroy direction, especially after moving there. He attended games in the late 80s and, in doing so, met Leon Weigard. The Lions used Dyson's services for a case and the new Lions fan didn't charge a cent. Impressed, Weigard brought Dyson onto his board of directors. Dyson assumed that this was an honorary role in a club that had a stable financial base. Cut to a year later, and he'd pretty much accidentally become president of a corporate entity that was such a financial basket case that it technically broke the company's law and had done so for a decade. But we'll get to that in a minute. It had been a rocky road from the start for our man Dyson. His club's best and fairest the year prior, Scott Clayton, immediately retired. At Dyson's first board meeting, head coach Rod Austin resigned when the board refused to extend his contract. The second meeting featured a coup to oust Weigard from his presidential position as a faction had taken umbrage to Weigard's somewhat dictatorial decision-making processes, such as the overruling of the move to Brisbane. The coup attempt, ironically, fell to division from within. This ended up causing the vice president, who was the coup's preferred leader, to leave the club, taking his Campbell sponsorship with him. Shit. We could have really used that money. And not much later, the club's financial projections for 1991 were revealed. Even despite a $660,000 payment from the Adelaide Crows as they joined the league, the Lions were $1 million in the hole. And here's where I have to interject. I'm lucky enough to have a good spread of age ranges watching, and incidentally shout out to the 0.5% female audience as I'm writing this. Oh god. Anyway, at least 60% of you, statistically, were born after 1991, and as such may only remember a time when the AFL was too big to fail. Let me show you what things were like in the dark days of Ross Oakley. In 2024, the AFL's revenue was $1.039 billion. Yeah, with a B, billion. In its last year before nationalisation, 1989, the AFL reported a revenue of around $25 million, or around $66 million in today's money. The AFL's 2024 surplus of over $45 million, which is not bad for a non-profit organisation, makes the 1989 surplus of $262 grand look completely insignificant, even if you pad it with inflation to $679 large in modern capitalist apocalypse dollars. That's a difference of 66 times the amount, not to mention knock-on effects from the 1987 Wall Street crash and decades worth of overspending league-wide that left anywhere between 6 and 9 clubs technically bankrupt or functionally insolvent, depending on what reports you read. VFL clubs weren't run at a profit during the post-Coulter Rule years. They were run to win premierships, no matter the cost. The salary cap and draft had kind of fixed that of late, with new and better TV deals certainly helping, but if we revisit our ways that footy clubs can make money, well, a lot of clubs were still poorly served. Small, shitty grounds that footy's rapidly rising professionalism had outpaced provided little incentives to attend games. Collingwood, the biggest Victorian club, had a shade under 15,000 members in 1990, and remember, they were one of those functionally bankrupt teams from 4 years before. 3-game memberships and flexies were still 30 years away, as were pet memberships, of course. Hence, the smaller clubs, who thanks to the salary cap floor were now spending pretty much the same as the bigger clubs, found it way easier to fail to get that money back from the fans. Hence the million-dollar holes that Richmond, Footscray, St Kilda and our boys from old Carlton now, hello Princes Park, found themselves in. To plug this hole, Fitzroy would take out an annual $1 million loan, which was secured against the AFL payments each club would receive the next year. This both kept the lights on and switched them off at the same time, as this arrangement was undertaken during some of the biggest loan interest rates in our nation's history, ranging anywhere from 10 to 17.5%. For each $1 million loan, Fitzroy would accrue up to $175,000 in interest repayments, and the cycle worsened every year due to the aforementioned lack of real money coming in. So the board had to go back out to the streets and rattle those tins. $800,000 was the goal. A quarter of that was collected by literal tin rattling, and although they hit their target a month late, they still hit it. It looked like they were saved. Until their financial report came in for that year, showing that their losses all but neutralised the entire proceeds from that fundraiser. Now, a quick tangent for an interesting piece of history. In Round 8, 1952, the VFL decided to host a propaganda round where matches were hosted in all kinds of places. Sydney, Brisbane, Albury, and even Euroa, birthplace of David Boone. Merv Hughes. Shit, I gotta stop doing that. That round, Fitzroy hosts a game at the North Hobart Oval against the Demons side headed by Norm Smith in his first season out of Fitzroy. Bizarrely, a fan stealing the game ball wasn't the most bizarre occurrence of the entire game, as Tony Ongarello kicked 7 goals to steer the Gorillas. Oh my god, I forgot they were called that. Anyway, to steer Fitzroy to a win against 1950s Melbourne. Crazy. The Lions desperately needed more cash in 1991 though, and so they decided to sell some of their home games to Tasmania. Thus, they returned to North Hobart some 40 years after that triumph, but made an error in bringing eventual 1991 Premier in Hawthorn along for the ride. Ben Allen got nearly half of his 1991 goals in this game, his 7 one of 4 hauls of 5 or more from the Hawks that day, as they powered to 231 points, only falling just short of Fitzroy's all-time scoring record. The 157-point loss remains the worst in the club's history, which, if you consider what happens over the next 5 years, is actually kind of remarkable. They managed to draw very decent numbers, but the AFL failed to help out with travel and accommodation costs, which helped contribute to this venture losing even more money. Back to Dyson though. Of course, we've touched on him being a Melbourne fan, slowly becoming a Fitzroy fan. Leon Weigard taps him on the shoulder to help do a couple of things, and he ends up becoming the fucking vice president, which is just bizarre. And circumstances were about to happen that would steer him almost completely accidentally into becoming the president outright. And here's where I introduce you properly to Gary Pert. Gary Pert was from a Fitzroy family. Like Kevin Murray, his dad was a Roy boy and in fact played most of his 128 games alongside Big Kev. And like Kevin Murray, Gary made his debut at 16 years old. He was an instant star, playing for Victoria at 18 and becoming an All-Australian a year later. He was a quick and mobile fullback who used a towering leap and raking kick to outspeed opponents, fly in with a grab, and launch quick counter-offensives. He was fantastic to watch. His 1987 was cut short by a knee injury though, and his 1988 was interrupted by an unusual incident. One night, eating dinner with his girlfriend, he choked on a biscuit so badly it damaged his esophagus. Or at least that's how he said he hurt his throat. Valentine's Day can be crazy. That joke's not making it, surely. Despite this, he became the deputy captain to his good mate, and a man who debuted in the same game that he did. Kevin Murray won his Brownlow with the number 1 on his back, but the club's game record holder didn't start his career with it. He gave the number to Rob Shepherd after he retired, who after 3 years of service gave it to a past his prime Johnny Rantle for his single year stay. It lay unused for a year before they gave it to an 18-year-old with the world at his feet and the burdens of huge expectation. But Paul Roos was better than anyone could have dreamed. He shared an almost psychic connection with Pert, and the two formed an imperious defensive partnership. In 1989, Pert went on to win the club's best and fairest. Now, he'd signed a 3-year deal which ran out at the end of 1990, which became significant when, at the start of that year, Pert again damaged his knee. This time, though, he'd missed a full season before it even started. In this era, players had two ways of earning contract money. The first and main method was base payments, ranging from around $15,000 to low six figures. This was a player's day-to-day salary. The second was bonuses for playing games. This could be a rather lucrative part of a contract, and if you, say, were a regular starter who missed the whole season because of one unlucky injury, you could find yourself unexpectedly way out of pocket. Missing all of 1991 meant he would forfeit his match payment bonuses and only earn his base salary, but for some reason, Pert thought he was entitled to be paid as if he would play every 1991 game. The board obviously disagreed and entered negotiations, desperate to keep their star man. They were close to the salary cap as it was, which is actually kind of crazy considering how mediocre they were, but as with his defending on the footy field, Pert's approach was aggressive and resistant. Each side offered a number. None were accepted. With the contract renewal looking out of the question and not wanting to pay an out-of-contract player to not play for a full year, the Lions only really had one option. And so the board do the only thing they feel they can. They delist Gary Pert. But this doesn't work for either side. See, Gary wants to go to Collingwood specifically. Wonder why. But if he's delisted, he has to nominate for that new draft thing, meaning that every club can have a go at him. Sadly for him, Collingwood have just won their first flag in 32 years, putting them dead last in the queue. He would likely go to the last place sides, which include the place he's trying to get away from. Fitzroy, likewise, also suffers because they get nothing in return for losing their vice-captain. So, Weigard proposed an innovative solution. He struck a deal with his Collingwood counterparts that they'd let Pert walk to Collingwood in exchange for 2 draft picks and $120,000, which would be buried in the financial logs as membership income. Innovative, yes, but also illegal, as players could not be sold for cash. Not anymore. That's why the league was in such a terrible financial situation. The AFL or VFL wanted to stop that, so you can't do that in the 90s. Hall Lacey find out and threatened to formally complain to the AFL if the Pies didn't nix the deal. They didn't, so he was forced to dob on his own club. Evidence was buried, red tape was laid, and by the time the hearing began, the trade had already happened, and Hall Lacey was just ready to drop everything. Oh, and the AFL had threatened to fine Fitzroy $250,000, which would have crippled them financially and completely destroyed their reputation, so that's something to consider as well. In the end, Fitzroy lost both Pert and the money. Once Weigard returned from an AFL business trip, he immediately resigned. Dyson Hall Lacey was now in charge. He would be the 15th and final man to serve as Fitzroy's president in the VFL/AFL. Dyson's first hurdle as president was that the AFL had knocked back an extension to a Fitzroy loan deadline. Dyson says only 3 people outside the AFL knew the details, including him. In an indication of the AFL's abject lack of media secrecy concerning the club in its final years, the full story with all details still find it to Mike Sheehan's smarmy, smirking pen. Dyson attempted to expose the leak, and all he got was a piss-weak Sheehan gaslighting attempt. Unfortunately, this pattern of media reporting would continue and cast damaging aspersions on the club, which hastened their downfall. The Pert compensation draft selections shaped up as legacy-defining picks, but came in a shallow draft. Only 2 200-gamers were selected that year, one not even being the best player in his family, and neither were picked up by the Roys. Jeremy Gard and Brett Cook were selected, neither of whom were really that good, although neither were terrible. Gard was delisted at the end of a 2-win 1995 season, while Cook would almost take 3 full years to make the first of 25 Lions appearances, although he would end up in a grand final later on in life. Pert would play 70 times for the Pies as they began their decline toward their first wooden spoon. Everyone lost, except for Gary's bank account, but there would be one defining moment that emerged from all of this mess. Round 11, 1992. Fitzroy host Collingwood at Carlton's house. Lot of rivalries there. The Roys hold dominance for most of the game, keeping the Pies goalless in the first and being 27 points to the good come three-quarter time. The Pies, though, come back with Pert being moved up front. The Pies shock the Roys with 2 early goals, but Lynch drives one home from 50 and nearly gets on the end of a Wielden pass, bringing the lead back to 23. But Collingwood, inspired by a majestic mark from James Manson, who we'll meet properly later on, grab goals with Watson, McGuan and Lehman, all men who averaged under a goal per game in their careers. How exactly did this team win a flag 18 months ago? The gap gets as low as 4, but of all people, Jeremy Gard slots his third goal to extend the lead to 10 with 6 minutes left. Incidentally, Gard would never score 3 in a single game again across the rest of his 68-match career. The intensity goes up. Ruse throws himself into a contest, demolishing his old pal Gary, but it's no good as Troy freaking Lehman gets an absolute wonder snap from 45 metres. With 2 minutes left, Manson, in his weird lumbering style, tries for glory but misses. The kick-in finds a contest, and Manson, who's worked his arse off to get to that contest from the other flank in about 10 seconds, breaks it up. His efforts are rewarded. The ball falls to Fraser with a laser into the hotspot. 2 Roys commit to the contest, Seacamp leaving his man to fly high, but about 3 inches too low. The ball clears him and bounces its merry way along to the man that Seacamp left behind. Of all the people on the ground, it had to be him. Gary Pert would only kick 2 more AFL goals in his life, and neither of them would have felt anywhere near as good as this against the sinking ship he escaped, helping the aircraft carrier he fled to secure second on the ladder with a late winner. Now, some of you might be saying, oh, he's a Roy boy at heart, he'd never really feel that way. Well, 1, he demanded to go to Collingwood specifically, this is where he really wants to be, and 2, look at the celebration. No respect, colours nailed to mast. 1 minute, 49 seconds to go, and that fucking happens. It's a brutal way to finish the game for a supporter base that's known little but pain for 40 years. Cut to 50 seconds left. We have a throw-in. In an admission of defeat, Stephen Paxman is serving as the main ruck today. No wonder Fitzroy finished second last in hitouts for the season, and it's a miracle he's landed 12 hitouts against the big monster Monkhorst. Monkhorst, of course, adds to his tally here, punching it toward the line to kill time. He succeeds, but it takes a bad hop. Paul Broderick is able to get it and finds someone down the line. Jeremy Gard. The bounce. The recruit Fitzroy picked up for the loss of Pert. Could this be a sign? He lofts it up to a pack. Ruse flies, but can't come down with it. Abbott picks it up. He's stripped of it, but Paul Ruse grabs it. It was perfect. If Ruse had come flying through the heavens and got the biggest mark of his career, it'd be too glorious, not fitting of the occasion. No. Just like everything else over the last decade, the Roys had to scrap and scrounge for everything they could get. And so it was here. Ruse plucks the ball out of the air, turns in traffic and heaves a desperate effort over his shoulder, and somehow, some way, it goes flying through the big sticks. And look, did this change anything materially for Fitzroy? No. Win or loss, they'd finish 10th with a bigger number in the L column than the W column. But not only did this win lift the spirits of the club and fan base by getting one over on the prodigal son, but this one win prevented that shit heap Collingwood team from finishing top. Instead, they would face a fresh offer bye St Kilda in a sudden death elimination final and lose, sparking the crumbling of an empire that never really got going. So, that's a win for Fitzroy in my book. And that's great, but fuzzy feelings were being outweighed by material losses. Perth's departure had opened the floodgates in 1991, Jason Taylor departing for Hawthorn and playing 80 games. His replacement played 4. The Roys would win a trade with the Hawks, but 39 games to 0 isn't a huge bragging point. Former best and fairest Darren Kapler left as part of the Greg Williams deal. Fitzroy got some Carlton cast-offs whose best days were past them. To add insult to injury, the Lions finished second last. Shockingly, though, a 600-point swing shift in points scored and conceded Shockingly, though, a 600-point swing shift in points scored and conceded guided them to 10th in 1992. It doesn't sound great, but it is Fitzroy's highest finishing position in the AFL era. It will remain so forever and marks the point where I really stop talking in depth about season-to-season results, about cool players and fun moments. Now, it's more about the club simply staying alive week to week. In the trade period, John McCarthy enters for pick 55. Now, he's a great swingman that will prove useful in the Lions' dying days. Unfortunately, pick 55 lands Matty Capuano for the Roos, who will become a dual premiership ruckman. As they say in France, les oops. August 1992. Fitzroy have budgeted for a small profit for the year. They discover they've lost just over $950,000. Dyson and his board discover the club's debts tally $1.5 million. They went to the AFL Commission seeking an early advance of the AFL's traditional end-of-year payment to clubs, about $1.1 million, and a loan to cover the remainder. This would be one of the last Commission meetings before the system was changed from club representatives to AFL-appointed suits, so the Lions actually got a fair shake. Negotiations dragged out to December, though, which allowed backroom politics to get involved. The deal tentatively had the loan placed as a debenture against the Fitzroy Club Hotel, which I'll talk about later. However, other clubs got curious why Fitzroy were being raised as a topic of discussion. Dyson rang around the clubs, which made Ross Oakley very angry. The AFL promptly withdrew support of the loan, meaning Fitzroy had to convince the bank themselves that they were good for the money. The league stalled and attempted to railroad Dyson into liquidating or rushing a merger agreement within the next 2 weeks. Dyson refused and threatened legal action unless Fitzroy could have a meeting with the full commission. Graham Samuel and Jeff Brown ran numbers past the commission that contradicted independent numbers generated by a QC. The AFL, in response, got their own QC to offer contradictory advice to that, although this was later proved as a falsehood. And, of course, again, news reports emerged of the meeting details that only could have come from AFL House. At 10 p.m. on December 16, Oakley rang Dyson and confirmed the AFL would not offer any financial support to Fitzroy. They were on their own. The meeting was the next morning, and the AFL rebuked their arguments but backed down once Fitzroy's QC, Dr. Peter Buchanan, entered the room. The AFL quickly opted for a vote. Only Geelong and Footscray sided with the Lions. Dyson's final comments were berating the AFL for not addressing or maybe encouraging leaks to the media concerning sensitive details about Fitzroy's financial state, of how reporters seemed to take girlish glee in writing Fitzroy hit pieces. Oakley's response was to say, "Oh yes, we are totally concerned as well. Say, Dyson, old fellow, who do you reckon the leak is?" And Dyson, with balls clacking like a pendulous Newton's cradle, pointed out his suspect, who went a shade of red similar to Fitzroy's own jumper. After that, Peter Scanlon comes along with what Dyson believes was the AFL's plan the whole time, a loan secured on the promise of a merger the next year. Dyson, of course, told him to get stuffed before the board went on their own media offensive. While doing so, Dyson was approached by Collingwood for a merger proposal, apparently on the recommendation of an AFL commissioner, which Dyson refused. And guess what headlines were on the back of the Herald Sun 2 days later? No leak my arse. December 21, Dyson receives the news that the bank has refused Fitzroy's credit application. Dyson responded asking Robert Baker, a Westpac representative and key figure in negotiations, exactly what was needed to secure a line of credit. He gave 3 key points which seemed to match what the AFL promised in a meeting on December 2. Dyson approached a hesitant AFL about it, and after dragging negotiations out until December 23rd, finally got their line of credit. But the AFL's strong-arming and insistence on a merger being the solution to the thorn in the lion's paw, as it were, would become an overshadowing theme of the final years of this football club. 1993 rolls around and Fitzroy has thrown the bank at James Manson, splurging pick 10 on Collingwood's premiership ruckman in the trade period and thanking their lucky stars that deal didn't bite them in the arse totally, as Manson got only 137 hitouts in 1993, about the same as a bunch of second rucks, helping Fitzroy sit comfortably last in that stat. Thankfully, McCarthy was a much better recruit, kicking 40 goals 13 as part of an accurate forward-line setup. Zanotti, Roos, and a young Stephen Paxman held a firm backline up, and Paul Broderick and Matt Armstrong put up fine numbers in the middle of the park. And then there's the story of Michael Dunstan. Taken at pick 40 in the 1992 draft, he was injected straight into the starting lineup in Game 1 of 1993 against Carlton. He kicks 2 goals with his first 2 kicks as Fitzroy start strong but get reeled in and overtaken by a superior Blues outfit. Despite trailing by 4 goals at three-quarter time and only scoring 5 goals from the 20-minute mark of the first to three-quarter time, the Roys pile on 5 goals to 2 to trail by only 6 with about 2.5 minutes to go. Doc Wilden gets a free for holding in the centre square. He lofts it to a contest, it spills, Tom Alvin bangs it on the boot, the kick travelling maybe 12 metres, where it finds Marcus Seecamp. A defender, Seecamp will never be a prolific goal kicker. This, his 1993 season, was his highest tally with 4, but he streamed up the ground and from 25 out on a slight angle, evens the scores with a major in-swinger. At this point, Dyson Hall-Lacey would be happy with a draw. Carlton press it forward, but Seecamp breaks up a Kernahan marking attempt. Ball up. Brendan Gale gets it out, Armstrong does beautiful work to progress the play, Norrish boots it in hope but only finds Brown. Broderick stops him dead, Roos gathers, links with Armstrong who never stops running, and he finds a lone figure about 20 metres out. Michael Dunstan gets to live out every footy kid's dream in his first ever game. He kicks a goal, his third, which is the deciding score. For the rest of Fitzroy's existence, no other man on his club debut will score as many goals. He will kick 20 for the season, very respectable, but his career would end in 1995 after being traded to West Coast and suffering serious injuries. But today, he was the hero of a side a lot of people thought wouldn't even be able to make it to the start of the 1993 season itself. Lions fans rush the ground, celebrating with their jubilant heroes. But the main reason why 1993 Fitzroy won half their games was a familiar face in a different position. With no more Osborne, etc., the Roys desperately need a hero up front. After 7 weeks, the experiments they have run appear to have failed. Alistair Lynch is getting a lot of the ball and providing opportunities for his teammates, but it's not translating to outright scoring power for Lynch himself. He's only scored 6 goals 9 so far, nice, and now he has to face the reigning premier in West Coast. Sure enough, he scores 6 goals 1 in this game alone. Glenn Jakovic and Guy McKenna, 2 of the greatest defenders in the league, have no answer for him. This begins a wild run in which Lynch will only go goalless once and score less than 4 goals in a further 4 out of the remaining 13 matches. He went nuts. He kicked 7 against North, as much as their twin forward stars combined. Fitzroy won by 1. He went up against 2 of 1993's top 3 sides and a Footscray team who'd finish 11-9. He kicked 20 goals in that 3-week span. His final hammer blow on the league before ending with only a brace against Melbourne was outscoring the Brisbane Bears by himself, 7-4 to 5-13, with 18 touches and 13 marks in a best on ground performance so obvious he got 2 votes for it. Brisbane, well, they liked what they saw, and they'd noticed that the kid had just scored 62 goals in 13 matches, slightly more than the ageing Roger Merritt had averaged over the full year. They also knew that Fitzroy was financially destitute. They also knew that Nathan Buckley, the inaugural Rising Star winner for the Bears, wanted to fuck right off to Victoria. They needed a gun player to generate interest and increase their flagging attendance numbers, as after 6 years they finally moved to the city they were named for. They had turned to Jason Dunstall for a Queensland homecoming, but he opted to stay at Hawthorn because, success. Unfortunately for Fitzroy, Brisbane's head of recruitment happened to be Scott Clayton, who knew all too well how good his former teammate in Alistair was. So they offered Lynch a deal that at the time, and even for decades after, the league had never seen the like of. A 10-year contract reportedly totaling $2.1 million in value, 3 times the money per year that he was getting from the Lions. Lynch didn't really have a choice. He took it. This was the moment. Sure, other players had tumbled out from this sickeningly lurching carnival ride en masse in the years prior, but none were as critical or as representative of the future as the departure of Alistair Lynch. The Fitzroy Lions would live on for a little longer yet, but this was the moment they were truly consigned to their grave. This was the terminal diagnosis. There was no way back. The Lions, for signing on the dotted line for their cemetery plot, received pick 7 as well as 2 players who combined for 13 games. Lynch, despite a broken collarbone, would match that himself in 1994 alone. In fact, the nominal pick traded for the 2 compensation players, number 64, landed Brisbane a 16-game player. Yeah. The pick that was so valueless it was traded essentially as an obligation, something to fill the space in the received column for Brisbane, was more valuable than the players deemed of the same value of a man who, 10 years from now, would kick 70 goals in what should have been a premiership season at the age of 36. One person who certainly thought that this was the end was Paul Broderick. It was a no-brainer for Broderick, who was a huge Richmond fan himself. In return, Fitzroy wanted midfielder Craig Lambert and Tigers skipper Jeff Hogg. The plan was simple: straight swap the 2 midfielders and the Tigers would send Hogg to Princes Park for a couple of lesser lights. Then, again, Brisbane ruined everything by enticing Lambert so hard he quit Richmond entirely and joined the Bears as a free agent. Richmond then pressured Fitzroy into lumping Broderick into the Hogg deal, even though they really didn't have to. Richmond threw in a goal net as a set of steak knives, and boom.
The worst trade deal maybe ever signed anywhere, but certainly ever signed in this country.
Fitzroy had their Lynch replacement and came out of the deal looking far rosier than Richmond, who'd just sold their captain off for what seemed like a box full of pick and mix. The reality was anything but. Brendan Gale combined with his brother, who also left Fitzroy for the Tigers, to play 91 games and later lead them into an unparalleled run of success as a suit, while Broderick immediately finished runner-up in Richmond's best and fairest, albeit at the time that wasn't a difficult thing to do. He would salute as champion in 1996, right as Hogg ended up retiring due to strains in his back. Matt Dundas, who'd only missed 5 games across the last 3 years, also left, also for Richmond. Jamie Elliott, no not that one, moved teams whilst 133-gamer Brett Stevens retired. Peter Caven, a promising young defender, left to become teammates with a man who once tried to kill him. The reason Caven and Lynch could so easily leave was that the AFL brought in special concession deals for the two struggling expansion sides that deeply affected Fitzroy. Aside from that, the best player the Lions picked up after that exodus was a past at Stevens stretch, and there's a reason for all of the trade losses that have just happened and will happen in the future. Neville Stibbard had been the Roy's recruitment manager until North lured him away in 1993. The Roys had no one to replace him with and no money to give to said no one. Glenn Worry, who was also the football operations manager and secretary of the selection committee, had to add this role to his already overstuffed portfolio, and despite his hard work, it showed. And in addition to all of that, they were dealt another major loss.
Fitzroy's stay at Princes Park hadn't yielded any sort of financial benefit whatsoever. Carlton had tried to limit access to some of their favourite areas of the ground, such as the John Elliott Shrine to John Elliott, located in the John Elliott Centre, for dedication to John Elliott. The first lease, which ran out in 1992, gave Fitzroy a share of ad revenue, probably a small one, but no part of catering money and limited ticketing shares. The new for 93 deal was on even worse terms, as Carlton knew that they were pretty much the only game in town. No other nearby venue wanted a bar of the Roys. They did try and swing a deal to return to Brunswick Street, but didn't have the $250,000 required. Plus, the AFL had guaranteed Princes Park 22 games per season, easy while Hawthorn shared the ground, but now they were at Waverley. Fitzroy were pretty much contractually obliged to play at Princes Park even if they got no money to do so. In fact, for 1993, they had to pay $6,000 for the privilege. They lost money on the deal, thanks to the Blues lying about ad revenue. Then, an ironic saviour came along. Footscray had been doing well for themselves ever since the 1989 merger deal fell over. They made finals in 1992 with only Geelong proving their kryptonite. They had two Brownlow medal winners in their midfield and a bevy of other talent besides, but faced pressures to move out of their beloved Western Oval where they'd lived since 1883. If they had another team playing out of here, it might give the AFL an incentive to let them retain their ground. Peter Gordon, the man who'd scuppered the 1989 merger plans, came to Fitzroy in 1993 and gave them an extremely good offer. Almost full advertising revenue, guaranteed revenue from reserved member seating such as this, full car parking revenue, and way more catering revenue than Carlton were offering, even though the Dogs would keep about $100,000 a year for themselves, which, I mean, that's all fair. And they'd give Fitzroy full and open use of all Western Oval facilities. And, as a sweetener, Footscray gave them an interest-free loan of $250,000 for the Lions to pay their AFL debts, which secured Fitzroy's future, as the debt might have been used as a last resort bullet in the Lions' head if the talks to get out of Princes Park failed. Gordon secured support from the Fitzroy fan committees and coteries, but the Roys, needing yet another AFL cash advance, this time of $200,000, threatened to scupper the deal. The league was already pissed off at the Roys as they'd entered a sponsorship deal with Solo, a Schweppes product, with the league of course having a sponsorship deal with their rivals in Coca-Cola. The players were deeply concerned about having to move so far from their home, but the cash flow was just a serious issue too. It was insurmountable in the end. Fitzroy made an offer to the AFL that if the... Didn't you blow that siren already? Fitzroy made an offer to the AFL that if they were cash negative by August of 1994... Look at me, I've got a saving button. The players were understandably concerned about having to transplant their club all the way across town, but the cash flow was just too serious an issue to overcome. Fitzroy made an offer to the AFL that if they were still cash negative by August 1994, they would seek to merge. The AFL refused. No ambiguity was accepted. They would only accept Fitzroy dead or very much alive. Moving to the Western Oval was the only way, Dyson would later say, to save the club. Even the cheer squad seemed to agree. The banner read for the Lions' final game at Princes Park: the deal with Carlton was a total farce. Let's win this final game and shove it up there. Well, no word on if John Elliott saw that. Hope he did. Okay, John. This game presents itself to us 30 years later, as highly ironic. The Bears come to meet an in-form Lions, and although the Brisbane side are struggling, this is a side that still beat the Lions at the Gabba earlier this year. But Fitzroy came to play, seemingly knowing that they were about to move to a football landscape and culture that to them may as well have been the Arctic. They made hay. Ross Lyon, an enforcer so tough his former coach and Robert Shaw called him the Whispering Death, poleaxes Brad Pearce into a hospital bed in minute 1. That set the tone. 4 other Bears, including Marcus Ashcroft, suffered injuries and things got rough. Alistair Lynch, in his penultimate Lions fixture, made his presence felt with 7 goals and a headbutt on former Lion Scott McIver. Must have made Lynchy real popular when he arrived on Brisbane shores. The Lions, in their last true great performance... I'm going to kill that siren operator, I swear to Christ. The Lions, in their last true great performance, kept the Bears to a single goal in the first 3 quarters, leading by 122 at the time, but faded away as junk time began. 147 points scored and a 101-point win would be their best figures in any game in the 1990s. One last moment of glory achieved. Now it was time to move house, and if the Lynch deal didn't wipe the heart and soul out of the club, this sure did. The club's home was moved all the way across town to a windy shithouse old suburban oval next to a rail yard and shared with a club that the VFL had recently tried to smush them together with to create some kind of footballing Cronenberg monster. The breeze was such that in some quarters scores resembled the VFL's Old Testament, the rain rendered the oval virtually unusable come the springtime, and there was no shelter from the bitter conditions save for a couple of old decrepit stands on the members' wing. Whilst there, Fitzroyites could look forward to taunting barbs from the Footscray supporters. Perceptions of the suburb had now changed since the local manufacturing industries had moved west, and the multicultural, lower middle class sort of feel, that coffee shop frequenter Fitzroy stereotype of person, was not welcome in a suburb that saw its own as working class battlers and saw hubcaps as community items rather than owned by an individual. Little did they know that in 30 years both suburbs would look and feel practically identical. Thanks, gentrification. Being stuck here in an unwelcome neighbourhood that held nothing but hurt in terms of recent memories was insulting, and it was an admission that there was no turning back for Fitzroy. The deal was a 20-year lease, which was ambitious considering the financial state of the club, but also considering that this was their 4th different home ground in the last 8 years. It would be like Body Blue's 900th shag of the day proposing marriage, except she's a great deal richer than Fitzroy were. Westpac had again become flighty, taking away Fitzroy's ability to take out an overdraft. The Lions were given 10 days to live by the AFL before managing to come to a complicated financial arrangement that delayed the fixture release for the following season, such was the uncertainty around their survival. Dyson was actually forced to call the players in for a meeting to fully explain the financial situation of the club and assure the players that no matter what happened, the AFL would guarantee that their salaries would be safe.
Hey, sorry to jump startle you, just popping in to shill the Patreon. The Patreon members of this channel have had exclusive access to the released parts of this documentary for 2 months now, and will get early and ad-free access to all videos I create. As soon as they are finished, they go straight on the Patreon, so no need to wait for videos. So come join if that's your bag. Now back to the video. Okay, that's a lot of bad stuff for 1 year, so before we move on to 1994, a bit of levity. It's round 10, 1993. Fitzroy are humming along in 4th, facing an Essendon side who are good but haven't really realised it yet. First term, Robert Shaw's about to make some moves on the phone when he hears an unexpected voice. Kevin Sheedy, Essendon coach if you're not familiar. Sheeds is barking instructions to be relayed to Mark Harvey, mainly to knock Paul Roos all the way back to Fitzroy. After a confused hello, which Sheeds doesn't hear, Shaw concludes that there's a crossed line and he may as well play it in his favour. He tells Ross Lyon to go tell Harvey, "Oi, you knock Roosie, I'll knock you like I will in 2012. Thank you to the 2 people who get that. Shaw counters every single Sheedy move before Essendon's players even have a chance to obey them. Now, our old mate Bill Stephen is in the box, and he isn't happy with any of this. Says it's against the spirit of the game. Come on, Bill, it's the 1990s. Let's bastard it up a bit, eh? Shorey, though, since this is Fitzroy, says, okay, let's give in to the spirit of things, but give me one more goal. Now, one more. maybe one more after that for luck. We get to half-time, the Roys are 23 points up, and Shorey finally gives in to the angel on his shoulder, telling Sheeds about the mix-up. Sheeds says, okay, we make no changes for the first 10 minutes, and then we'll just do our own thing. Well, the Bombers pile on 5 goals in that time and end up taking the match by 4 points, with Buick giving them the lead in the final minute. Bad ending, yes, but bloody funny and a good story, which is again what Fitzroy are all about. Also, James Manson got 3 votes that day, underlining how weird the whole affair was. Despite all of this, 1994 started out kinda well. Now, Dyson might have grandstanded the side's quality a bit, saying in the 1993 annual report that the 1994 side would be, quote, second to none, but a close loss to the Pies and a win against the Bombers in their final appearance at Prince's Park as the home team got the fans excited. Then came round 3, their first home game at the Western Oval against those Bears. It was perfect. Well, not quite. Lynch still hadn't returned from a collarbone injury, which made it all the easier for the Lions to simply skip away and hold the Bears at arm's length from the start. Young guns Paxman and McGregor starred, whilst that man Hogg scored 5. A loss away to the Eagles was to be expected, although disappointing in its volume, and then young Brad Boyd has a breakout game by leading the Lions to their second home win in the West from 2 starts in a shootout against an inspired Simon Minton-Connell Swans. They were 3-2, well in the top 8 even after the round 6 bye, and then they had to travel to Punt Road. Hogg got a goal, but that was his only kick. Brendan Gale doubled that for the Tigers, whilst Broderick got 36 touches and 2 goals. 10 Tigers scored as the Lions were put to the sword. North broke their perfect Western Oval record the next week, and the losing began in earnest. It took until round 12 when the Lions snuck a win against the Hawks of all teams to register win number 4. The next week they faced Footscray. At both teams' home ground, the Lions lost by 104 points. That did it. Of the final 26 games the Roys would play at home at Western Oval, they would lose 25. Talks were reignited with Melbourne to merge. The Hawks and Roos got word and tried to insert themselves into discussions, but the Lions board was set on Melbourne for one main reason: the name. Fitzroy were in a poor position in terms of power and doubted that Hawthorn would allow their identity to be taken over in the name of a merged entity by the smallest club in the game. North had practically said a name change wasn't part of their desired terms. But Melbourne, it was perfect. Being the name of the city, it afforded a more generic identity rather than the name being tied specifically to the Demons. Plus, the lads that were in charge were more receptive to a nickname change than those other sides. There were problems though. Melbourne's fans were seen as rich and elitist, which contrasted with the more working class Fitzroy base. The feelings between the two were summed up well by this comment from a Melbourne fan to Dyson Hall-Lacey in the late 80s after the Demons once again beat the Lions. Despite this, the two presidents were confident enough in their initial proposal that they were able to present to the AFL Commission in August. By September, the press had got a hold of the story, held surprise, and scuppered their plans, in addition to disagreements between the two on the name and colours of the merged entity. Fitzroy were doomed again, but then an unlikely saviour turned up. Seriously. A random foreign country just decides to help out. Real random. Like, honestly, guess a country. Any country in the world. I guarantee you won't get it right. You guessed one? No, you idiot, that's not it. Guess one starting with N. The Netherlands, maybe? Nigeria? Nepal? Nope. It's Nauru, a 21 square kilometre island nation close to our shores which got rich from exporting phosphate left in large quantities from bird shit. Yeah, for real. Fitzroy's salvation lies in the same stuff that seagulls leave on your car, provided by an island 500 times smaller than the city they were based in. Oh, God. In October 1994, our very old friend George Coates, he of the Lion logo, put Dyson in contact with former Lions junior Kinza Clodumar, the financial advisor to Nauru's president, and was able to get a deal done. The government-controlled Nauru Insurance Corporation lent $1.2 million over a 7-year term, with Clodumar elected to the Fitzroy board, which saved the Lions. For now. But there were no more knights in shining armour floating around. If they had any chance of pulling out of this death dive, they needed to do what they did in the 1980s and what they did last year. Win and play entertaining football. Of course, that had been made harder by the loss of even more quality players. Jim Wynd, Matt Armstrong and Michael Dunstan had missed only a handful of games over the last 2 years and were key assets. Well, not anymore. Wynd, a former Victoria representative and 137-game midfielder, was shown the door despite playing every single 1994 game. Then you have Matt Armstrong, a slick disposer of the ball who'd featured over 130 times across halfback in the midfield, and he was traded away for a completely comprehensive loss. Dunstan, Fitzroy's fourth highest goal scorer in 1993, was flipped off to West Coast, where unfortunately injury decimated his career. In one of the rarest gems, a Fitzroy trade win, they landed pick 19 for him, which was Ben Holland, a 150-gamer. Unfortunately, none of those games came at the Roys. Traded after only 1 season for 2 picks, again almost a win as 1995's pick 16 was Shane Clayton, a premiership player, but of course that wouldn't be at Fitzroy. Marcus Seecamp was a very solid halfback and WA representative player, but Melbourne seemed to want him more than the Roys did. He was traded, and to be fair, the Roys landed a very good player in his response, but didn't live long enough to see his best work. In a bit of an I can't operate on this boy, he's my son twist, this man's best work was, for the Lions, just not these ones, but we will get there. Peter Sartori was a handy forward for Carlton who'd come to the Roys in exchange for Darren Kapler. After an injury-plagued season where he'd still polled 5 Brownlow votes in 9 games, he retires in his 20s. David Bain, a former Sandover medalist and Brisbane best and fairest, plays 12 games in the seniors and somehow still wins the reserve comp MVP. But that doesn't save him. He's delisted. David Johnson, a fairly reliable halfback, was cut after 25 games in 2 years, following a stint at Essendon. This in itself would be enough to announce the club was in a sheer transition, if not complete catastrophe, if not for 3 more departures of icons and cult heroes that really just confirmed Fitzroy's fate. It says something that the smallest of these names is arguably a man who remains a key figure in football 30 years after this, Ross Lyon. Delisted at the age of 27 after 127 games in the thankless gravel pit that was Fitzroy's backline, he moved to the Brisbane Bears of all teams. Unfortunately, knee injuries brought on by his rough-and-tumble play style ended his career very soon after, but his loss would be felt. More so would be the loss of Darren Wheeldon. Nicknamed Doc, this feisty forward was an absolute cult hero at the Roys, scoring 28 goals in 1994 to top the club's goal-kicking for the 2nd time, and that is a pitiful sum. Just for reference, that sum wouldn't have even got in the top 3 of a pre-Lockett Sydney. Ouch. But he did miss 7 games. His most famous incident came the year before when he was fined $750 for shaking a goalpost whilst an opponent was having a shot. Anyway, Fitzroy decided to thank the only man on the list with 2 goals per game by delisting him, likely due to his tendency to visit the tribunal or maybe his frequent tips to the TAB after trainings. Either way, it left yet another huge gaping hole up front. And on top of all that, there was the big one. Paul Roos was Fitzroy at this point. Aside from his 13-game rookie season, he'd only failed to play 20 matches in a season once across 13 years. For his past 122 games of 269 so far, he'd been the captain. But the club's inability to pay him, plus the Western Oval move, forced him to look elsewhere. Initially, Adelaide was his preferred move, where he would have linked up with Robert Shaw, who'd also left the club at the end of 1994, and likely ended his career with a flag in a squad where he would have been the most experienced by a factor of about 48. A trade couldn't be sorted though, and he fell to the pre-season draft. Adelaide, with pick 7, had to plump for Peter Vardy, a leading goal kicker in a premiership year, so not bad. Paul Roos, of course, went at pick 1 in that draft to Sydney. It was heavily ironic. Roos moved to a club that wouldn't have had the cash for him not 2 years ago, from the very club that had turned down the move to Sydney that would have been its salvation. It hadn't been smooth sailing for the Swans though, far from it. If the Roys were a club in crisis, the Swans were a club that had drowned in a crisis, been rescued, only to fall back into the crisis in an almost endless loop of drowning and recovery. But their latest and final recovery bid had essentially given them the status of being underwritten by the AFL thanks to the ending of private ownership of clubs. They now had the money to swoop in on established want-away icons like Tony Lockett and, yes, Paul Roos. And look, with all the relocations and money trouble, I haven't talked about Roos anywhere near enough. The fans loved him, and why wouldn't they? He was a halfback who got nearly 20 touches a game in the 80s and 90s, and yet scored on average each time he played, as he could be a force up front too. He got 7 goals in his 5th game of league footy, albeit against intermission years St Kilda. They loved him so much, they came up with a chant for him every time he got the ball, yelling "Roos" in a deep tone that sounded a bit like booing, but it was pure love from the heart. And this set the tone for players going forward whose names sounded vaguely like a boo to be given the Roos chant. Luke Bruce, Bruce Reveley, they can all thank Paul Roos for the support that their own fans give them today. He'd even tried to help the club out of its financial jam, offering to be the face of a solo ad campaign for free, even if it did piss the AFL off a bit. Roos went on to coach Sydney to 2 grand finals in the 2000s, winning one of them and ending the longest premiership drought in history. Despite being the best team of the 2000s, that's something that Adelaide never managed, but might have if it landed him in 1994. That doesn't hurt to think about at all.
Fitzroy's lineup in their final week of 1994 had 1,723 games of experience. Their lineup in round 1, 1995 had 1,243, and a quarter of that was Doug Hawkins. Yeah, that Doug Hawkins, the Footscray legend who had a wing named for him at his home ground while he was still playing. Thanks to the Whitten Oval deal, he would continue to play home games there in new colours in 1995, edging ever closer to 350 games and still playing football that, by Fitzroy standards at least, can still be considered fantastic.
1994 would only produce 5 wins for the Lions, kept out of last by a late-season win over a Sydney side that was drowning in its own blood. When the Swans got Tony Lockett that off-season, it left Fitzroy all alone, with 2 wins in stone-cold, motherless last for 1995. Their only wins? A nail-biter against a typically terrible St Kilda, and an Adelaide match that's actually worth talking about. Robert Shaw had decided, with 6 games to go in 1994, to flee the sinking ship. He'd done all he could to arrest the slide, but he could see that forces beyond any individual's control were torpedoing any aspirations for success that the club had. Graham Corns' acrimonious departure from the Crows had opened a vacancy that Shaw was all too ready to fill, and of course he'd nearly lured the last true star that Fitzroy would ever have. He would prove to be the Crows' worst coach in their history, at least with working follicles on their head at the very least. In a troubled 2-year stint that saw the side win consecutive flags the moment he left. However, he did leave a legacy by engineering the Groom-MacLeod trade, something Corns stated he never would have done. This proved a greater legacy than his replacement at Fitzroy would leave. On the day Shaw faced his old side for the first time, none other than Super Boot himself led the Lions. Quinlan's inexperience had been outweighed by his eagerness and support from the fans, with the board appointing him for those reasons pretty much alone. His appointment brought new enthusiasm into the club, but the results hadn't changed. Well, until now. The ball pinballs to open the match, but the Crows score a minor in the first 40 seconds, before Modra scores a miracle goal for normal people, but a normal goal for that miracle man a minute later. It looks like normal service will resume. For Fitzroy's heart to start firing here, only one man can restart it, himself the true heart of Fitzroy. Shane Malloy was a notable player in the typical GAZ-man quirky way, a hard-nosed back pocket who kicked a goal once every 15 games in his 5 seasons at the Roy's. One of those was the very first scored at Waverley Park. He would go on to have a son. His name was Jared, and he bled maroon, blue and gold. A massive figure, he began life as a forward but would make a name for himself in defence, with the young fella given the unenviable task of minding guys like Lockett, Ablett and Modra in their primes. But Jared Malloy intercepts a Wellman mark attempt and bombs one from 50, and in the dying stages of the first, Wellman gets pinged for running too far, the rarest of all duels, with Adam McCarthy converting to put an inaccurate Lions in the lead at quarter time. Modra makes a mockery of Paxman to open the scoring in the second, with Jarman adding on another a long time after that. Scoring is at a premium in this one, which makes consecutive goals from Johnson and Jeremy Gard all the more valuable. Adelaide are only able to close by 1 point in the term, but then the third term exposes Fitzroy's lack of conditioning. Jarman scores, then he loops a handball over to Modra to give the Crows the lead. The Crows begin intercepting well, resulting in repeated forward presses. Zanotti falls under pressure, catching Liptak high, who converts with the surgical precision that would later serve him well as a doctor. That wasn't good enough for him, as he clunks a miracle mark which enables Dr. Mario over here to extend the Crows' margin to 19. Then a Brad Boyd bomb clears the corridor of uncertainty, with Chris Johnson scoring one against the Tide with dash the Crows cannot account for. Then a ruck infringement from Matt Connell gives Fitzroy a free kick on the wing with a minute left. Cleverly, Danny Morton picks Pittman's pocket.
Pathetic effort from Pittman in ruck.
And takes advantage, streaming into space and bombing one home from 50. The lead is reduced to 8, with question marks over whether the Crows can hold on or if the last placed Lions can muster their way home in a low-scoring game. Fitzroy strike immediately after getting lucky with a James Manson thing that somehow wasn't holding the ball. Hawkins lofts one up, Chris Johnson marks on the goal line and, in an act almost ahead of his time, runs around and snaps the goal. His third. Matt Dent then gets a free in the back line. John Barker, an unheralded player in his day, is able to run half the ground thanks to Modra's allergy to defence. The move almost breaks down after Paxman does this. Then Johnson mops up and finds Brad Boyd. Okay, I've mentioned him in passing enough. I think it's properly time to introduce you to Bradley Boyd. The leader of this doomed voyage, only Wayne Carey came close when comparing the start of season age of the 1996 Skippers. Carey had proven himself a champion already, but Boyd only had 54 games of experience, the greenest captain in the AFL if you count state tier caps for the expansion lads. However, Boyd was himself a star, coming second and first in the last 2 best and fairest counts, earning state of origin selection in both years. He'd had his lows, originally being a Collingwood boy. He was traded after some off-field indiscretions highlighted a seeming lack of commitment and professionalism, but he was dropped after 2 games in 1992 at Fitzroy and began to track the same path. Ross Lyon, though, got him out of the funk. He told Boyd to give the match selection committee an ultimatum. He did, got put in the guts in the Magoos and played well enough to get senior footy. He was tall, strong, clean and could run all day, beginning as a tagger but becoming a damaging ruck rover in his own right. He, like Lyon and Ruse and indeed the rest, started to receive invites to play elsewhere, but he felt loyalty to the club that had saved his career. When that 1994 exodus happened, Quinlan was so impressed at Boyd's guile and heart that he made the 23-year-old the captain, not that he had much choice. Sadly, Boyd was fairly injury-prone due to his toughness at the ball. He'd also suffered stress fractures in his back that exacerbated those issues. Like other experienced Roy's hands, he was used as positional spack filler rotating around the ground. But he would be the somewhat reluctant external face of the club and a key pillar of the playing group in these 2 forsaken years we've got coming up. Back to the game, except hang on a bit. Despite Adelaide being less experienced as an entity than Lions utility Jason Baldwin, the rivalry between these two sides is very much real. It dates back to their first matchup, Baldwin's 25th game in 1991. 90 seconds left, Adelaide are 9 points down. David Marshall receives a high free kick that wasn't high and cuts the gap to 3. The ump then lets a high bump go but pings the Roys for something? No idea what. Big kick, contest, Andrew Jarman gets brushed on the back of the neck but sells it like he's been shot in the face and the ump buys it. Might have been a hold, but it was a late call if so. His inside 50 kick goes to ground, a Lion is held, no free, but Adelaide win one for, well, you tell me. Rod Jamieson kicks a goal after the siren to win it and plants the seed of a rivalry that sure won't last long, but the sentiments from this one are held even to today by some Lions faithful, and fair enough, like this win would have lifted them from 14th to 14th. Anyway, that's the backstory. Back to this game for real. Baldwin then comes to the rescue after a Modra-Jarman combo nearly produces magic, but the Crows keep hammering away, the Lions forced to double team the dangerous Modra. However, this just leaves Brown free, who finds Jarman, who never misses short-range shots like this. Don't show that footage ever again. Jarman puts Adelaide up by 1. He then puts Adelaide up by 2 after missing one from short range. If that was a pie, he would have grabbed that. See, Fitzroy were having trouble getting past Smart and Tasker down back, who were intercepting everything at this point. Here's McKinnon with an example which begins a move that ends with a Jarman assist to David Brown. Margin 8 points, 8 minutes 50 seconds to go. Fitzroy gets the clearance. An awkward kick bounces over the usual Crow interceptor, allowing Morton some space. He passes to, oh god, it's Manson. That drunken kicking style does no favours for Peter Bird, but he draws a free kick from Tasker that puts the Lions within 2. The Roys find new resolve, with Malloy looking like a wounded soldier after this battle and then a sniper victim after this one. Then Doug Hawkins, who'd been moved to the forward flank, comes alive, assisting the goal that puts the Roys up, then finding former fellow Footscrayite Simon Atkins with a rocket hand pass. Atkins follows up with one of his own to Danny Morton, who adds another goal. A mere minute later, he outpaces Mark Bickley, somehow, to mark on the lead. He slams it home. All of a sudden, a 16-point margin. But Dougie ain't done yet. Some 40 seconds later, while tackled, he finds Chris Johnson with a hand pass, and a nifty chain of handballs to Adam McCarthy seals it with his third. 3 minutes left, 87 to 65, but the Roys still aren't finished. Brad Boyd kicks another skipper's goal roving from a pack. The Roys find it yet again after that, the ball ending up in the hands of James Manson. He knows the Roys are home and he celebrates as he lines up for his kick. This will be the final moment of happiness in a career that will end 7 games and 7 losses later. With his trademark awkward kicking style, he sees it home. Bernie Quinlan only had to wait a minute more before running onto the field victorious. Of the 98 Fitzroy wins he had been involved with, this was no doubt one of the sweetest. It was also his last. After the Titanic struck that iceberg and started to sink, the band appointed to play on the ship did something very special. To help quell the panic, they shrugged their shoulders, donned their instruments, moved to the first-class lounge, and played to help calm the passengers. They would later move their show to the forward deck, almost serenading the passengers as they were loaded onto the lifeboats. Fitzroy's players in the 1990s, at least the ones that hung around, had no choice but to play for the benefit of those suffering through watching this doomed vessel slowly disappear beneath the waves. Of course, there was music, but it was conditional on an increasingly rare Fitzroy win. La Marseillaise, or at least Fitzroy's bastardized version of it, didn't merely bring comfort and calmness to a panicked mass, it provided joy, happiness, both fleeting and rare emotions at the Lions at the time. Much like on the deck of the Titanic, hearing the band made people think that things might just be alright. Bill Stephen recalls hearing people sing his creation at Prince's Park in the one little chamber Carlton allowed them to sully. It kept the Fitzroy people together, he noted, and it filled him with pride to know that something he and his mates did 40-odd years ago gave such meaning to these people during the darkest of hours. And on this day, against Adelaide, Bernie Quinlan smiles as he hears it one final time. The club was sinking, a terminal case, and yet the band still played on. It completely fell apart from there, though. Quinlan proved a largely ineffective coach in all respects, which would be bad enough if the squad was at an average AFL level, which it wasn't, and that's before factoring in on-field distractions, which the Lions of course had a few of. When the Swans signed Tony Lockett in 1995, the Lions were training in the building that South Melbourne had abandoned for their Sydney move. It was sad. It should have been the Sydney Lions. Lockett should be wearing this. And it was about to get sadder.
The Lions were getting kicked out as the venue was about to become the home base of Athletics Victoria, and the car park was about to legitimately take and host the Grand Prix from 1995 onwards. They found a home, Coburg City Oval, where the Coburg VFA team would share with them. One problem though, when the Lions turned up to move their stuff out of Lakeside, they'd been locked out, unpaid bills and all of that. Good riddance though. Alistair Lynch recalled that on the Albert Park Oval, sometimes the players had to huddle into tiny, small areas as those were the only lights that worked. So obviously Coburg was a massive upgrade. Yes, so that's a professional National League team we're talking about here in the #1 sport in the country, just remember. Geelong legend Doug Wade, who luckily owned the gym next door at Lakeside, agreed to let them in so they could move their stuff to Coburg. They wrangled an agreement as volunteers, including 3 Lions players, readied Coburg for the move, but it wasn't up to the standard of the rest of the AFL. It was sandier than a beach, the oval had exposed plumbing pipes, and the lights were as reliable as a Jake Kelly defensive clearance. But indeed, much like the Saints at Moorabbin, the conditions and meagre resources helped band the lads together. Shit heap, yes, but it was their shit heap, which is nice, but when training on that sort of mess, you can see why their prospects never really improved.
Brief editorial. I would like to very much apologise for calling... very much apologise. I would like to say no offence meant to the Coburg Footy Club for calling their ground a shit heap. They were actually very, very accommodating in having me on the premises, so... I mean, nothing insulting by what I said about what the state of your ground was 30 years ago.
The Roys lost the last 15 games in a row, culminating in the second and final time in their history that the Lions allowed 200 points past them, this time against the North side over twice as experienced. 16 Kangaroos players were allowed some form of score in a game so bizarre that it was actually hosted at Junction Oval because the Western Oval was completely fucked. Seriously, thanks to the bitter wind and rain out in the west, the surface was normally crap by the end of the season, but with 2 teams playing out of there, the surface was completely unplayable by August. And yet, that Kangaroos game wasn't even the most embarrassing home game loss of the year. 3 weeks earlier, Western Oval hosted the Lions and the Swans, the 2 bottom-most sides of 1994, the 2 sides that arguably came the closest of everyone to shuttering their doors in the 1980s. What a match. The team that nearly took over the team they're renting the ground of, and the side that exists because the Lions refuse to go to Sydney. Oh, not to mention that Paul Roos, Fitzroy hero, was playing for the first time at Fitzroy's home in enemy colours, coached by the Lions' prime coaching target. Tony Lockett, a man who'd already kept one floundering franchise above water, was beginning to do so with another, and Roy's fans were about to see the most prolific day from the most prolific goalscorer in the league's history. Don't you feel lucky? Stephen Paxman initially had the assignment on Plugger, but he was a mere man up against a god. Fitzroy did score the first through Dougie Hawkins within the first minute. However, they only scored one more goal in the first term, again through the 35-year-old Hawkins. Lockett, on his own, scored 5 against what was described as a 3-goal breeze, mild for the Western Oval, but that does mean that technically Fitzroy kicked -1 goal. As Fitzroy were held to a solitary point in the second, Lockett kicked another 5, nearly giving the Swans a 100-point lead at the halfway mark of the game, with the Pac-Man being switched after goal number 7, 6 minutes after the second term resumed, and Simon Hawking was sent in to have 3 kicked on him. 17 minutes into the second, Mark Zanotti entered the fray. Zanotti is an interesting character. An undersized fullback and inaugural West Coast Eagle, he was cast out as soon as they saw remote success and found his way to the Brisbane Bears. He went from 3rd in the BNF in his first year there to being turfed out the same year they shipped 239 to the Cats. He nominated for the draft and was initially one of the very few players keen to join the Lions, until his demand for a 12 grand signing bonus exceeded the cap limit, Fitzroy's strategy there being one small basket holding 2 large eggs. Fitzroy drafted him against his wishes anyway, and Neville Stibbard found that 12 grand by staging illegitimate raffles, and were lucky the AFL was too scared of the tickets clientele that they didn't want to prosecute. Zanotti found his fit at the Lions though, becoming a cult hero and playing good football. He'd copped it in the first term, with Tim Lane noting that perhaps Barassi had deliberately targeted him as he was Fitzroy's spirit. He received some hard tackles playing as an on-baller, and so Bernie decided to give him a rest by playing him on a red-hot Tony Lockett. Actually, that's not true. Zanotti made the call himself as Bernie was stunned into inaction by Fat Tony, his jaw bouncing off the floor, drool slowly leaking down his chin. Lockett was outrageous, regularly beating 2 Roy's men in the air, and despite being he burst away on a lead, beating 3 Lions defenders stationed on him for his 6th, for his best of the day. Fitzroy had taken to deicide, with Lockett being removed from play for 5 minutes to repair a cut to his head after his 5th goal in the first. Zanotti continued the theme by starting a fight with Lockett immediately after moving on to him, which was brave. Certainly braver than the staging attempt Zanotti performed, which began their disagreement. He copped a headlock for his trouble, which ended up getting spicy, according to Mark. Barassi ended up dragging Lockett, giving a 7 or 8 minute rest for the big fella to cool down and not do anything stupid. He and his Swans slowed their pace towards the end as Zanotti tightened the clamps, with Lockett chalking up 2 in the third and 4 in the last, despite accidentally benching himself, having misheard an instruction by Ron Barassi, which robbed him of a chance to grab Fred Fanning's single-game league record of 18. However, I would argue that this was the best performance a forward's ever had. Coventry's and Dunstall's 17-goal efforts contained a combined 9 misses, whilst Fanning competed in a league compromised by the effects of World War II. In addition, Fanning and Coventry played the entirety of their matches due to a lack of substitutions in leagues that ignored interstate talent. All 3, as well as all other 16-goal performances, were before quarters were shortened to 20 minutes in 1994. Even discounting the 10 to 15 minutes Lockett spent off the field, he scored at a greater rate per timed minute than anyone, ever, and no one has matched 16 since. All you could do as a Lions fan was sit back and applaud, as the losses had begun to lose all meaning.
But no matter how bad the beatings got, there was always a place to go back to. Not where I'm standing right now, but just over my shoulder. They wouldn't let me film inside. The Fitzroy Club Hotel had been bought out by Fitzroy in 1991 in an odd arrangement which I'll touch on later. But the club had literally made it their own. As with their training digs at Coburg, fans had been engaged to do some of the work, and even some of the players chipped in to give the place some new spritzes of paint, including starman John Rombotis. Players would go there to have a meal and stay for a chat with the fans. Raffles and competitions were held on team selection nights, and for $10 you could have a 2-course meal, often with the Lions stars sitting opposite. Supporters groups held fundraisers here, whilst players saw it as a great place to just get away from the chaotic world of footy. A stairway policed by portraits of stars from a bygone era led to the beating heart of any football club: administration. And buddy, this heart had severe arrhythmia. The Lions moved what passed for their HQ and admin facilities into the top couple of floors. Everything was analogue. No computers to speak of, nothing digital to be found here. It was too underdeveloped for the Brisbane Bears, for Bunton's sake. The whole place was outdated, decrepit, pure and simple. In other words, it was perfect for the Fitzroy Lions. It was the perfect refuge from the hurt Victoria Park engendered, from the disdain they felt at Princes Park, and from the barren cold of the Western Oval. A refuge they'd need more and more as 1994 turned into 1995, and as 1995 turned into 1996.
It was a good thing this deal was done, in hindsight. The hotel was nothing special, sure, especially compared to some other clubs' facilities and property portfolios, looking at you, Collingwood. However, it would soon hold enormous financial and tactical significance. Here's why, and warning, we're about to go into boring financial shit, and detail is important. The hotel was bought for $150,000, a low price, which was on a 20-year lease of $22,500 per annum. The purchase price had to be guaranteed, definition below, with money that Fitzroy, of course, didn't have. Dyson Hall Lacey sought out money from about 700 shareholders, and to ensure that if the club or the hotel went down, the other wouldn't be affected, it was financed like this. The shareholder money went into a shell company called Fitzroy Finances Limited. This contained a trust, the Fitzroy Hotel Trust, imaginative name, with the trustee being called Bondborough Proprietary Limited. The discretionary trust allowed the money from the hotel to go directly to the club without any middleman, and would be active as long as the club was solvent, read as long as it was in the AFL. The investors lent their money at a 10% interest rate, which was pretty low for the time all in all, and a debenture was placed on the assets of Bondborough, whose board of directors contained both Hall Lacey and Finlay, as well as 3 other directors of the footy club. Financially, this was all fairly stable. The yearly lease costs were outweighed by a single good celebration after a Princes Park game, with the total interest of the investors being no more than $15,000. However, the move to Whitten Oval meant a longer, harder journey to get back to the Fitzroy Club Hotel, and it was hard enough to get people to the hotel after a loss from the very closely located Princes Park, let alone from halfway across town. If it was wet, forget about it. With very little in the way of stands or shade at Fitzroy's resident quagmire, you were guaranteed to be dripping wet and miserable. Stuff the pub, I'm going home. When the Lions requested advances from the AFL, the loans were borrowed against the hotel, which was the only profitable part of this venture. By 1993, it got to the point where they couldn't borrow any more money against it, but the fact that they had such a valuable asset was the only reason they even got that far. When the club had the league hounding them for that $250,000, the hotel allowed the Carlton United breweries to not only sponsor the club, but give some extra cash to incentivise the hotel to only stock CUB products, almost folding the club there and then, as that CUB money went toward the club, not the AFL debts, which the league weren't happy about, but fuck them. The hotel also held special importance for discussions that would happen in 1996 concerning the final fate of the club, but we will get to that in a bit. Don't hound me. Most importantly, it provided the club with a meeting place, a home base, a fan refuge, a place for the players to drink away their sorrows with those fans.
Dougie Hawkins loved a bit of that. He was only at Fitzroy for just the 1 year, unfortunately. Should have been 2, thanks Mick Noonan, but he was already much loved thanks to his entertaining media appearances. He gave Fitzroy great service, and already having a wing on Whitten Oval named after him added an air of legitimacy to Fitzroy's tenure there. He was passionate too, sometimes too much, and as a result, he had a habit of talking back to umpires, like screaming back. One incident in 1995 resulted in a $1,000 fine. Not really much, but it would probably bankrupt Fitzroy. Fans of both the Bulldogs and the Lions rallied, though, offering to chip in. He managed to make a tidy $9,500 profit off of it. Maybe the whole side should have just clobbered Shane McInerney at 10 grand a pop, 120 umpires, let's call it. There's your debt written off right there. But Doug Hawkins, being a man of the people, well, he fit right in at Fitzroy.
This is what Fitzroy were all about. The players would have weekly dinners at the houses of the players who sponsored them. Others spent time raising whatever funds they could in whatever way they could. It was a local club, first and always. Unfortunately for the Lions, the AFL wasn't about local anymore. The last 15 years had seen national expansion of the competition to prevent its financial ruin. This could have been done in a few ways, but what we ended up with, because the VFL wanted to keep its power, was an expanded Victorian league that retained struggling suburban teams.
Hello, Footscray, whilst trying to represent whole states with singular entities. Hello, Adelaide. Their foray into rugby heartland hadn't worked, costing millions, meaning that less assets were available to the Fitzroys of the world. All of a sudden, there wasn't room in the AFL's expansionist remit for a local team. With 15 million sets of eyeballs to chase around the country, a crowd of 7,000 just wouldn't do it anymore.
The AFL was about to celebrate its centenary, admittedly a year before they were supposed to, but let's not get hung up on that. And they wanted to celebrate it with a new team. Fremantle had been added to the league after a year-long wait in 1995 to push the AFL to 16 teams. However, there was another waiting in the shadows.
The Port Adelaide Magpies had been waiting to spread their wings from the SANFL since the mid-1980s and almost booked their place in the league before rivals Glenelg forced a Supreme Court injunction on the AFL's negotiations, themselves protracted by the Victorian clubs holding the AFL to ransom over compensation payments. They'd reached an in-principle agreement before Fremantle had even played their first game in the league, even changing the name of their bid to the Power so as to satisfy Collingwood, but the AFL would not expand beyond 16 teams at the time, and Port were getting anxious, waiting on the sidelines. The AFL had seen the membership and financial boost that the Crows had provided to the league, and seen the marquee event that the Western Derby had become in only 1 year, and Port Adelaide was certain to do the same with their hometown rivals. They were desperate to cut a team, merge two struggling entities to force Port in. In 1995, they thought they had it, with Carlton and St Kilda having advanced talks. When that fell through, they reached out to Fitzroy in November and tabled an audacious proposal to merge the Lions with the Power to become the Power Lions. No, Power Lions. That sounds awful. Yeah, I guess it does sound like that. Oh dear. Fitzroy obviously refused what would have been the stupidest merger proposal in the AFL's history, although that wasn't the only stillborn proposal to relocate to South Australia for the Lions that year, with the SACA, the South Australian Cricket Association, wanting a Lions-Norwood hybrid to play out of the Adelaide Oval to maximise their own gate receipts. And these merger discussions are fun to talk about now, weird little thought experiments, but each one of them at the time chipped away ever so little at the soul of the Fitzroy Lions, and each of them chipped away deeper into the AFL's patience every time they got turned down. The AFL badly wanted Port Adelaide in the league, and Fitzroy was a thorn in their paw. In 1996, they couldn't wait any longer. They were going to make it happen. In 1996, they were going to kill the Fitzroy Lions, no matter what it took.